Hi, I'm Daniel Dornbush. I've been doing business development for small biotechs and large pharmaceutical companies for almost 20 years now. My educational background, I double majored at Cornell University in English and biology, got a master's at Tufts Medical School and Emerson College, and then got an MBA from Harvard. Happy to be here with you today to talk a little bit more about business development and concepts for life sciences. You've now heard about the gaps, how to fill those gaps, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about the other parts of the circle, determining some vehicles to fill those gaps, executing the deal, and then measuring success and maximizing success at the end. So, some vehicles in order to fill those gaps. We're going to talk today about some deal types, some structures used, how to identify some of those vehicles, and then using vehicles strategically to achieve those goals. But what I really want to emphasize today is that while we're going to talk about some very specific structures, really it represents a continuum. And to be creative in your work and your business development and your deals. You may create a new structure compared to these. But what you can do with the structures we talk about today, please combine them, use them creatively, find new ways to do them, and the fundamental piece of all of this is something that I like to call listen to the science. Do the right types of deals for your technology, your platform, for the products that you may be able to bring to market and help patients worldwide. So to start, we had to do some sort of organization, so we put them into 5 structures. A research collaboration, a license or license option, a development agreement, a commercialization agreement, and then an acquisition or acquisition option. Now again, here's some details which we're going to talk about in later slides, but I really want to emphasize again that you can combine these, for example. One way to do it is combine a research collaboration, a license option, with an option to acquire the company, the technology, the platform. What this can do is something that we call a build to buy. It's a great way for a larger company and a smaller company to get together and learn more about the technology, where the advantages are, how this will be positioned in the market as it moves through development. In early stages of any technology, it can be quite challenging to see where the most appropriate applications are for patients, for physicians, in markets, globally. And as it moves through, a lot of these answers can be determined. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about research collaborations. Some benefits are you can do some technology feasibility in order to build trust and knowledge, not only of your science and platform, but with your partner about their interest, their expertise, and the ability where your technology can best be used. Funding, really the range depends. It can be all over the map from very low to very high, depending on the excitement of the field, the economic promise, and the development stage of the compounds. Structures, ideally there's several structures in this, and it really depends on the area of research you're talking about. But one hallmark I think of success is to clarify what the success criteria are going to be in any research collaboration. Risks, this tends to be the lowest risk structure, which is also why it can be the easiest to complete and the fastest to happen. But it also can be easy to terminate, which can be good and bad for both sides. So you can get rid of research that didn't work and move on to ones that may. And then the key question I think of when I do research collaborations is who's going to own the data, who's going to have publication rights, who's going to have termination rights, and then option rights in the future. On a license or license option, a couple of benefits can be you can vary these deal structures in several ways. Globally, territory, field, potential options and issues. Funding here can be from multiple sources. For example, options as a product advances in development. There's a lot of ways you could do milestones in this. Structures can be from the very general to the very specific. Territory, indication, by customer, you can split these out in a lot of different ways. The risks in license options can be myriad. Precedents, you can actually raise the value for future, so a positive on this, but it can also limit an upside if you do a very cheap deal in the beginning. It can limit what the possible valuations could be in the future. So some key questions. What are you exactly giving up when you're doing a license option? Or as the acquirer, what are you actually gaining in the license option? Retaining and then sharing in the future. So let's talk about an example. A few of, I think, hallmarks of pharmaceuticals here, and I can talk about these because I was in no way involved with them, so there's no risk of any confidential information here. But an Onyx and Bayer deal, they did a fantastic deal years ago where Onyx licensed to Bayer their fundamental technology to their lead product. And it was also seen as a reason why Onyx was not able to sell themselves to any other suitor, despite a lot of pharmaceutical interest for many years. There was later a lawsuit, and the agreement was restructured, which we'll talk about a bit later. But essentially, this was a fantastic deal for Bayer, a fantastic deal for Onyx in many ways, that did evolve over time. It was also a really interesting Pharmacyclics, Janssen, AbbVie licensing deal. When J&J essentially purchased about a 50-50 profit split with Pharmacyclics in December 2011 for their lead compound, it was about $1 billion for the deal. Fast forward just a couple of years later, in 2015, AbbVie steps in and purchases the rest of the company for just about $21 billion. So where early licenses can limit, they can also release quite a lot of value in order to move, which moved the product forward. So let's talk about a development agreement. Benefits of development agreements can be leveraging resources from larger companies. Essentially, financial is one of them, but I'd really talk to small companies to think about what the advantages are for working with big companies in terms of the regulatory, the research, the preclinical, the animal models, and really the extent of the experience that larger companies have just by virtue of their being large with a lot of expertise. Funding, options to split in cases of territory exclusive licenses. What this essentially means is there's multiple ways to do these deals and multiple ways to split them to unlock the best value and the best partner. We'll talk about this in just a second. The structure here, again, highly variable, and it depends on the asset, the partners, and the goals. I would just make sure that you're listening to exactly what product, focusing on what product and where it's going and what makes the most sense for that specific one. A couple of risks, as always, ensure that you have the right partner. Is this person really, or is this company very expert and have a lot of resources in the indication that you're looking for, in the development area you're looking for? Is the deal structure representative of the strengths of both parties? And then finally, is it an organization, and have you organized this for future success? So some key questions. If you're talking about clinical trials, could this speed the clinical trials and your clinical development timeline? Could it speed the research? Legal review times. Is this going to slow things down with different legal reviews at different stop and go, no-go decisions? Approvals, and then we have go, no-go decisions at the end. So let's talk about an example to put some color around this. BMS did a very interesting deal with CytomX. Again, I wasn't involved in this one, though I have some friends who were, and it was a really interesting and I think an exemplary example of a great deal. You see the headlines here, which you can, of course, Google and get a lot more detail because so much of this was public. But essentially, it was a worldwide research collaboration and license agreement. Here's where we get to some of the combinations. To discover, develop, and commercialize novel therapies against multiple immuno-oncology targets using CytomX's great platform, which they've shown good progress here. The economics were quite attractive. $50 million up front, $300 in milestones plus sales royalties. But essentially what you see is a really clever way to leverage CytomX's platform, Bristol Myers' experience and in both clinical development and commercial to maximize the science of the platform. So advancing to commercial agreements. What we want to do in commercial agreements, really for the most part, is to maximize the assets of each party. It sounds trivial, but it can be so powerful when done well. And we've got an example coming up next. The funding of these really depends on the opportunity, the indication, the product, but usually includes things like royalties, profit splits, manufacturing costs, and marketing agreements. So the structure, again, focused on unlocking the value and creating the best commercial value for both parties, and therefore the biggest value, the biggest pie is always the metaphor in negotiations. Territories, indications, and customer channels, if these are right. The risks, of course, in these are capping commercial upside potentially if you're essentially valuing what the world and the global markets are going to be, so it's potential to cap it. And then working with different partners. You're picking a dance partner. In specific territories, you can't go back necessarily and do this again. So some key questions that you just need to ask yourself in these kind of commercial agreements, both on the buy side and the sell side. Is this the best partner? Is this the best structure? So an example. Illumina did a really interesting deal with 10x Genomics. It's a co-marketing deal. also known as a commercialization deal. There's a lot of different names for these. But essentially what they did is they announced one with a partnership for long read applications. So it's a technology play to partner what 10x Genomics, the platform here, and essentially Illumina's dominant commercial pipeline and presence. So what it was essentially providing customers with additional options for applications. It was a great way for 10x Genomics to reach a much broader set of customers, a great way for Illumina to increase its menu and pipeline. So then at the end, and a lot of these type of deals are, if it's not just a straight acquisition, and acquisition options are built onto all of the other, it can be built onto all of the other structures we talked about so far. So some benefits. It can be challenging for a licensor. And the question everybody always asks themselves around the table, are we selling the company here? And for how much? And is this the right number, which it will be in the future? Because there's a lot of questions between here and when that option is triggered. Funding can be cash, can be stock, can be combinations, can be royalties, can be milestones. All of these can be very useful tools in order to manage that type of a risk. And the structure, I think, depends on the stage. Are we talking about a development asset? Are we talking about a commercial asset? Do we know all of the indications that the assets can be going into, all of the customers that can be serving? All of these should be managed by different structures you set up in the deal you're talking about with your partner. So in the risks, balancing the risk and reward with risk mitigations. Easy to say, quite hard to do, and hard to do for both sides. So everybody has risks and identified their favorite or their most important list of risks. And the question is, how do you work with your partner to manage those on both sides? So calculations can sometimes benefit the acquirer. And there are some examples of that in the media. You can just take a look and Google those. But some key questions on both sides. Are we locking up the target? Are we locking up the company? Are we locking up the asset that we're really interested in? And then can you limit opportunity? So from the small company, the seller's point of view, if you do these kinds of acquisition options, it can often limit your opportunity to raise capital later. So in all of these deals, you want to think about what happens if things don't go according to plan, which few things do in biotech and pharmaceuticals. So when it doesn't go according to plan, what happens? And if you're locked up with some of the acquisition options with specific licenses to another company, it can be really hard to bring in an additional set of investors in order to get it from one situation to another. So just something to think about. And here's an example. Myriad did a very interesting deal with Crescendo several years ago. So Myriad Genetics, of course, known for their BRCA tests and their suite of genetic tests for oncology, essentially acquired and did an option deal with Crescendo, which is in the immunology space. Similar types of diagnostics, different indications. So what they did was, it was a 3-year option with an equation using a multiple of revenue and growth rate. And they had a one-time right to acquire Crescendo at a later date for a fixed purchase price. And so what this ended up doing was it put incentives for Crescendo, and Myriad for that matter, for sales, for revenue, for profits in order to achieve the milestones that were necessary for this. Crescendo got some cash, which was critical at the moment, and the deal ended up closing after 3 years, and Crescendo is now part of Myriad, and I hear doing quite well. So let's talk a little bit more about deal process and how to get these types of deals done. So some topics we could talk about, which is we don't have time today to address them fully. Non-binding term sheets can be very useful to clarify things on both sides. There's some questions from everyone about when do you sign a term sheet? Is it necessary? They're non-binding anyway. It usually always comes up at some point depending on the partners. Managing diligence and liabilities. There's no real perfect way to do this. The best is make sure you do it exhaustively on both sides. It doesn't mean take years to do it, but what it does mean is be very careful. When things go wrong, we can talk about indemnities, strategic alliances and deals in co-opetition. It's a term that was coined several years ago from companies doing deals with companies where we're trying to collaborate on one side and cooperate on one side, yet we're competing in a very similar area in another. It happens all the time. You just need to be very careful, which comes to competitive protections. How do you know when a deal is real and when another company is just snooping around for interest or a stalking horse? There's some hallmarks of this. A lot of this is experience. Some of this is just getting a great deal negotiator or a lawyer on your side, or just knowing the people on the other side, which we'll get to in just a minute. So we talked about some of the legal experience. The more experience you have in the area, I tend to find the better. And it doesn't have to be the negotiator. It can be, this is a team sport in many ways. Team sport from the research, the development, the clinical, the legal, the BD, management board. There's several ways to do this, but again, it really is a team effort to getting any of these done and to getting the best deal. So now let's turn to moving on in the process, executing the deal and measuring and maximizing success. In executing the deal, there's several ways to maximize your ability to do this. Working with stakeholders, finalizing a deal, measuring success, maximizing success. What we're going to do now is talk about the process of doing all of these. So there's no perfect way to represent this. All processes are slightly different, but we came up with some sort of a schema to give you some ideas about some of the generalizable pieces that are required and can lead to success in a collaboration. First is internal alignment, making sure that everyone working with your group, with your company, is aligned on goals, steps, processes, and prioritizations as much as possible in the early days, and doing so with white paper. Second is the partner integration, finding the right partner, and so how your goals can fit with theirs. It sounds pretty easy, but when it's actually done in practice, can be pretty complicated. And then once you start discussing, finding the right scope and structure to represent both parties' interests, and then the maximal ability for the platform, the technology, and the products you're developing to make an impact in the healthcare environment. Once you get all this right, then you can move right on to legal and contracting to make sure that you can put this all into a legally binding and tolerable format for everyone. Now, we have a little 3 to 30 times above this. Often you can get lucky and it works perfectly the first time. I'd call that, enjoy that when it happens, because sometimes this can be highly iterative and you have to go back and do this over and over again to make sure you have internal alignment, partner integration, and scope, and refine a scope and structure before you move on to integrating all of the priorities with all of the different groups within your company and the partner companies, which is why we have essentially a magnification of the puzzle pieces we have over here. Once this all happens, you can move off to finance sign-offs, corporate approvals, and then the dressing of the signatures and the press releases and the financial finalizations. All of these pieces are highly critical, but setting the stage and the initial times with the top row, I think is fundamental to success. So how can you maximize success once a deal is done? I would start with communication. I think this is a huge piece that can be transformative, and the difference between success and failure in so many ways. Feedback loops can create transparency and accountability. So we have some ways to do this, just some things to think about. Weekly meetings, monthly meetings, quarterly, and it depends on who's involved. So weekly calls with team leads, monthly calls with the larger project management groups, quarterly financial reviews can be helpful, and then annually on deal evaluation and project updates. And they can be useful in a couple of areas. First, just for the points of contacts to be organized in finance and R&D and commercial. And then also provide clear mechanisms for dispute resolution should these come up. Hopefully they won't, but they certainly can. So some key understandings. Though it may take years to sign a deal, it really is just the start of a relationship and building value. So a little statistic to define that, 30% of deals tend to get clarified, renegotiated, and revised. One of the major consulting companies just came up with this percentage. But let's talk about an example of one of those. Regeneron and Sanofi is one of my favorites. Again, one that I wasn't involved with, but one that I'm a big fan of how they've evolved this over time. Way back in 2003, the two companies got together and signed their first development agreement. Aventis, which became Sanofi during this time, took a 4% equity stake in Regeneron. In 2007, they updated and they revised the contract. Sanofi collaborated on a new drug discovery and development platform and paid up to $800 million, increasing their ownership share. 2009, Sanofi increased R&D. 2013, Regeneron paid Sanofi back, plus milestones to get some assets back. In 2015, a new immunotherapy collaboration where they actually alternate leads in development. One thing that we could overlay on this is the stock prices of Regeneron. We can talk about where Aventis, which was acquired by Sanofi at a premium. Some really great things happened to both companies in their market caps and valuations, financings, size. Just a success story, I think, on both sides. On the corollary, there are some disastrous examples, of course, in any situation, in any corporate environment. Here's just some things that tend to not go so well. Neglecting your company's interests, trying to get a deal done that the company and your stakeholders don't represent or want. Don't listen to the other side's needs. I've seen this happen before. Negotiators being inflexible and saying these are the only terms that are possible, take it or leave it. Anticipating issues, don't listen to the science, do a deal that doesn't apply to the scientific and the assets that you're talking about. These may seem obvious, but once negotiators and BD people, or people who, it doesn't have to be a BD person, someone in the middle of a negotiation can sometimes lose sight of the bigger picture and just try to get a deal done. I recommend trying to avoid all of these. But let's focus on the positive, because it's a lot easier to go that way. Hallmarks of outstanding business development. Some of these are just corollaries. Relationship building. Make sure you build trust on both sides so that there's active communication, you can solve problems and solve for the bigger issue. And part of that is to be able to listen to what's shared and then what isn't shared, what the other side can't share, but that sometimes you can read into what their sensitivities are in order to get the best deal done. Finding creative solutions. Essentially, that's taking the first two and putting it into practice, knowing your partner's constraints and their challenges, and then knowing that the relationship can be only the beginning. Obviously, if you're selling your company, it tends to be a one-time exchange. However, as we looked at in Sanofi and Regeneron, it really can be just the start of an evolution. So, in the BD timeline, it can reflect both long-term and short-term goals, from the search and evaluation, the diligence, the negotiations and contracts. Now let's talk about some advanced topics on each. So there's a lot more information, hopefully for future videos for you, but things to Google and to look at in addition. In the scientific analysis, really thinking through carefully the discovery, development, lead optimization, CMC, ADME, a lot of the pieces between the scientific, the therapeutic, the integration of care is being more and more important these days with complexity. And again, don't just look in the United States, look in different countries and how their healthcare systems, payment systems, approval systems can be different in different indications. And again, not just pharma, we're talking about other technologies as well. And then the commercial. Clinical use, an absolutely critical piece that so many early stage companies don't think about, how this will actually be used in the clinic when physicians are prescribing it, using it in the surgical suite. How is it actually done, used, combined? TPPs, TAMs, so target product profiles, total available markets, potential available markets, regional uses, all very useful, important things to work on in the negotiation. And on a personal level, there are rooms of books written on these types of things that you can go to your local libraries, but really, I think it comes down to several fundamental things. Curiosity, patience with the science, with people, with the sides with people that are not like you in different groups. Again, a team sport. Clear written and verbal communication can never be important enough, and then an ability to work with other people. It really is all about the people. I've never seen a deal get done between companies. It's always done between people. Here are some parallels to academia and some questions to consider as you in a lab developing your technology and your platform want to move forward with a partnership. What vehicles could you use? How could you establish collaborations? How do you structure them? Hopefully, we've given you some information and some ways to think about this. For further information, I urge you to take a look at Anatol's video, who's got some great insights into how to apply a lot of these for an academic audience purpose and technology. So hopefully by now we've achieved several, or hopefully all 5 of the BD course objectives here. We hope that by now you can define business development, identify the steps, understand how business development contributes, describe the different vehicles that business development can leverage, and successful deal structures. So just to wrap up, here are a few additional resources on business development to give you more information about what we touched on today. entrepreneurship centers, Coursera. Two of my favorites, Harvard Business Review has some great in-depth articles going back decades now. Fierce Biotech, as well as several other weekly, monthly, and newsletters can give you great insights into the types of deals that are working well, ones that are working well over time, and then where trends are moving in the industries. Thank you very much for watching.